Our text this morning opens up with God telling the prophet Elijah to go live in the city of Zarephath, which was a part of the Gentile kingdom of Sidon. So it's worth noting why God would send him there. And to understand that, we need a bit of background. The story takes place during the reign of Israel's King Ahab, who is described as doing more to provoke the anger of the Almighty God of Israel than had all the kings of Israel who were before him. And one of the things that Ahab did that provoked God was to take Jezebel as his wife. And for some reason, Ahab thought it would be a good idea to serve Jezebel's god Baal instead of Yahweh, the God of Israel. So God told Elijah to let Ahab know that the land was in for a tremendous drought that would last for 3 years. And so after Elijah had delivered his message to Ahab, Elijah was instructed by God to make his retreat to a valley that was known to provide an intermittent seasonal stream. And it was there that ravens would bring him bread and food. But eventually the stream dried up. And that's where this morning's text opens up, with God sending Elijah to the Gentile city of Zarephath to live until the drought was over. Living in a Gentile city probably would have been bad enough. But what made it even worse was the fact that this particular city belonged to the kingdom of Sidon. And Jezebel just happened to be the daughter of the king of Sidon. God was sending Elijah to the homeland of the very person who personified everything that was evil in the mind of Elijah. And so I believe that this story is more than a miracle story about God's provision for us during difficult times. That may be true, but if we stop there, I think we miss an important part of what the tale is offering to its audience. When God told Elijah to go live in the land of Sidon, God was telling him to make his home among his enemies. And why in the world would God tell him to do that? I think maybe it was to learn that the people Elijah thought were his enemies actually weren't his enemies at all. They were human beings who lived and loved and suffered just like he did. I believe it's a story about the spiritual transformation of someone who was considered to be one of the greatest prophets of the Hebrew Bible. So our text opens up with what appears to be a very resentful and disgruntled Elijah entering the city with a chip on his shoulder. Elijah finds the widow whom God has said would care for him, and without so much as a "How do you do? My name is Elijah," he tells this stranger to bring him some water. And before she could bring it, Elijah asked for some bread too. Elijah had a lot of nerve, or a monumental sense of entitlement, to ask a strange woman for food in the midst of a famine. She would certainly have been justified in feeling resentful and irritated at his request. But she responded by saying she only had a handful of flour and a bit of oil, and she planned to make one last meal with it for herself and her son. One can only imagine her sense of hopelessness and despair that once she and her son had eaten the last bit of bread, they would die of starvation. The appropriate response would have at least been a bit of sympathy. Or maybe Elijah might have apologized for his presumption. But instead, he made the outrageous and insensitive request to go ahead and make a cake with the flour, but to feed him first and afterwards make something for herself and her son. And even though Elijah was a foreigner, she was a woman and he was a man. And so she probably felt compelled to obey him. And miraculously, there was enough for that day, and for the next day, and for the next week. And in fact, the oil and flour never ran out. And that's where this morning's text ends. But it's not really the ending of the story. Because in time, the widow's son became ill. And the reader is told that the illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. So Elijah cried out to God in desperation, and the son was healed. The Elijah we see at the end of the story, and Elijah who desperately prays to God on behalf of the son's health, is not the same insensitive Elijah we find at the beginning of the story, who demands that a stranger supply him with food and drink. The Elijah we see here is a transformed Elijah, an Elijah who has come to look into the face of the enemy only to discover that they aren't an enemy after all. His transformation was one that would have taken place as he and the widow maybe swapped ancient legends, each from their own culture. One that happened as Elijah decided the boy was probably more well-mannered than most youth he had encountered. The transformation would have occurred as they shared the never-ending bread supply, one possibly preferring theirs toasted while the other favoring theirs fresh from the oven. And so might this be why God sent Elijah to this woman? To learn that when you spend time with someone, when you break bread with them and come to know them, they aren't your enemy. They are children of God, also created in God's image. And might you and I be open to the same lesson? Are we willing, even grudgingly, to look into the face of our opponents, spend time with them, and see them as someone other than as our enemy? This is a hard lesson for me, but it's a lesson that the Bible is very clear about. The book of Proverbs plainly says to not gloat when our enemies stumble and fall. And it says also, if your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat, and if they are thirsty, give them water to drink. Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And if we don't outright ignore the passages, we might make excuses about why they don't apply to us. We might even say, but that's so hard, as if that settles the matter and exempts us from making an effort. Elijah wasn't exempted, and neither are we, much as I wish that I were. But feelings of hatred and resentment are toxic. And if you know someone who has been steeped in those feelings for an extended period of years, maybe even a lifetime, you know how sad and tragic they are. You and I may not be that far gone, but the seed is planted within us when we see other people as our enemy or opponent. And in time, that seed will grow. And it's up to us to see to its transformation from a seed of prejudice against our perceived adversary into a seed of love for our neighbor. It's up to us to do the hard work of loosening the grip that it has on our lives. because it's only then that we are able to accept the truth that we both belong to God and we also belong to each other. I don't know about you, but as a person of faith, I've got some work to do. And that work includes being in relationship with people I would really rather not call my neighbor. And more than likely, I'll spend the rest of my life working at that task. But I want to experience freedom from the toxicity of hatred and prejudice. Maybe you do too. If so, then join me as we work at learning that our enemies aren't really our enemies after all. Amen.